All right, welcome to The Explainer. Every billion-dollar industry has to start somewhere, right? A day one. For video games, that day didn't happen in some fancy boardroom. Nope, it started with a handful of students, one single game, and a really wild idea. This is the story of the very first coin ever dropped into a video game machine and how it, maybe accidentally, kickstarted a revolution.
So that's the big question, isn't it? And it's the exact problem a few students at Stanford were wrestling with back in the early 1970s. See, a game had completely taken over the campus computer labs, captivating an entire generation of programmers. But it had one giant, glaring flaw from a business perspective: it was totally free.
Okay, so our story really kicks off with this underground phenomenon, a game that spread like wildfire through university computer labs, passed from one programmer to another. It was called Spacewar, and it proved for the very first time that interactive video games had this huge and completely untapped audience.
And yeah, this thing was a hit pretty much everywhere it popped up. But the absolute, hands-down epicenter of this whole craze, that was Stanford's AI lab. For the brilliant students and researchers there, Spacewar wasn't just some distraction. It was a core part of the culture, with tournaments that would run deep into the night. But here's the thing. While all these brilliant people were just, geeking out and playing the game, two students saw something completely different. They weren't just looking at the screen, they were looking at the crowd around the screen. And they saw a business, a revolutionary one. So who were these guys? Meet Bill Pitts and Hugh. Pitts was the coder, an adventurous student who'd kind of stumbled into the computer lab and just gotten totally hooked. Tuck was his high school friend, and he was the one with the business mind. He's the one who looked at this whole scene, the crowds, the passion, and asked that super simple but totally game-changing question. Hey, why aren't we charging people for this? I mean, what a brilliant idea, right? But turning that dream into an actual physical thing, that was a whole other story. It involved solving a massive technological and financial problem. It wasn't just about slapping a coin slot on a computer, not even close. And here's why. This was the first giant hurdle. See, the computers back then that could actually run Spacewar, we're talking machines that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and that's in 1970s money. So how on earth could you make a profit charging like a dime a play on a machine that expensive? The numbers just didn't add up.
But then, a breakthrough. In 1970, this new, cheaper computer comes out called the PDP-11. Now, don't get me wrong, it was still crazy expensive, but it was just barely possible. And that was the opening Pitts and Tuck needed. They moved at an absolutely incredible speed. They formed their company in May of '71, and get this, by November, just 6 months later, their game was up and running.
And you gotta understand, they weren't just making a lazy copy of the game. Oh no. They basically re-engineered Spacewar from the ground up for a paying audience. They added all these little innovations. Like, to stop people from getting spawn camped, you'd respawn invisible and invincible for a few seconds. Smart, right? And to keep the games moving, they put in a fuel limit. They even added a single-player practice mode so new players wouldn't get totally demolished right away. And their vision, it went way beyond just the software. They really got that they weren't just selling a game, they were selling a whole experience. They had this gorgeous custom-made walnut cabinet built. They hid the actual computer in another room, so all you saw was this cool machine. And the controls? Get this, they used authentic joysticks from a B-52 bomber. I mean, come on. This was a million miles away from just playing on some boring metal box in a lab.
So, November 1971. The big day arrives. They launched their creation, which they named Galaxy Game, right there in the student union at Stanford. And the student response was, well, it was immediate and it was absolutely insane.
The game was a total out-of-the-park home run. It instantly proved their main idea was right. People would absolutely pay to play. The lines got so long that within a week, they actually had to rig up a second monitor above the main one, just so the crowds of people could watch what was going on. So on the surface, the business model looked golden. 10 cents a game, a quarter for 3. The coins were just clinking into that machine nonstop. It was always in use. I mean, by every single measure of popularity, it was a massive success. But popularity and profit are two very different things.
Okay, so let's look at the cold, hard numbers, the harsh reality. That first machine, it cost their families around $20,000 to build. At 10 cents a pop, they would need 200,000 games played just to break even on the hardware. Just
Think about that. The math was absolutely brutal.
And yet, you can kind of see why they did it, right? They saw those long lines of players, and they doubled down. Their second machine was even fancier, more ambitious, with this sleek fiberglass body. But the cost? It just blew up. A staggering $60,000. And at that point, the fatal flaw in their entire plan became impossible to ignore.
It just didn't matter how popular the game was. The ROI was basically a black hole. They had created something that people truly, deeply loved, but the cost of the tech was just way too high to build a real business. That dream of putting these machines on every college campus in the country? Yeah, that was over. So yeah, their company wasn't going to scale. Their dream of building a video game empire kind of fizzled out. But what they created, this sort of flawed masterpiece, it ended up changing everything. It left behind this incredible legacy.
So what was their real accomplishment here? Let's be clear, Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck invented the arcade game, full stop. Galaxy Game was the very first commercial, coin-operated video arcade game ever. And it was the first undeniable proof that this massive, hungry market for video games was just sitting there, waiting.
You know, in the end, their project wasn't a financial win. But what it really was a multi-billion-dollar question that they asked the entire world. And it inspired that next wave of innovators, guys like Nolan Bushnell, who saw those long lines for Galaxy Game and he just knew, that if somebody could just crack that cost problem, they'd be sitting on an absolute goldmine. The first coin was in. The game was well and truly on.